Hi. Have you wanted to start watercolor painting but have no idea what you're doing? Well, fear not, I'm going to give you 9 tips and tricks to help improve your watercolor painting. My first tip is how to choose the right watercolor paint. Now, this applies to cheap and expensive watercolor paints. So what you want to do is run your finger along the watercolor paint before you buy it. If the watercolor paint kind of feels like school chalk, do not buy it. This paint has a lot of talc, I don't really know how to say it, but it's basically a filler pigment and it will leave a white grainy substance on your paintings. It basically leaves like a film over everything you draw. Instead, what you want to be looking for is when you drag your finger over the top of the watercolor paints, they should feel very nice and smooth and almost a bit glossy. They should shine a little under the light. These paints will have less filler pigment and leave a nice, smooth, transparent wash over your drawings. My next tip is how to mix any skin color you want with only 4 paint colors. The paint colors you will need are red, yellow, green, and purple. With these 4 paints, you can make every skin tone known to man. Let's start with our medium skin tone. I'm mixing together equal parts red and yellow till I get a nice orange, and then I'm adding little bits of green to desaturate it. The green helps the skin tone look a little bit more organic. So using the skin tone as our base, I'm now going to go into a lighter skin tone. I'm going to add a little bit more red to the paint and a lot more water. Now on to our darkest skin tone. Again, I'm going to be using our mid-tone as a base, and then I'm going to add a bit more green and I'm going to add purple. Purple really deepens and richens a skin tone. By layering the skin tone, you can get some really nice dark shades. Now feel free to tweak these paints as much as you want to get any skin tone you desire. Now moving on, I'm going to teach you guys how to build a watercolor palette for cheap. I suggest buying watercolor tubes. Watercolor tubes are essentially tubes filled with liquid watercolor. And if you buy little watercolor half pans, you can squeeze the watercolor from the tubes into them and allow it to dry into a hard pan. And then you can mix any of the colors you buy together to make hundreds of different paint shades. Let's talk about watercolor brushes. There are so many different types of watercolor brushes, but I'm going to touch on the 2 different types that I know, which are brushes with low snap and brushes with high snap. Brushes with low snap are essentially very soft brushes that if you push down on the bristles, they don't immediately snap back into place. Meanwhile, brushes with high snap are brushes that you can run your finger over the tip of the brush and it will snap back into place right away. Brushes with low snap hold a lot of water and are really good for doing really artistic kind of painterly paintings. Meanwhile, brushes with low snap hold less water and give you more control over the area that you put the paint on. I find that brushes with low snap can give you really cool effects, while brushes with high snap give you a really flat, nice color. Personally, I prefer brushes with a high snap because you can do little details and get very nice, precise lines. On to a tip that I think every watercolor painter should know, which is to soak your watercolor pans. Now you might be asking, what is soaking your watercolor pans? Soaking your watercolor pans is essentially adding a few drops of water into the watercolor pan and letting it sit for a few minutes so the paint can absorb the water. The reason you do this is because when the paint sucks up the water, it activates the paint and makes it so much more pigmented. As you can see, the paints that I've soaked are so much more pigmented than the ones that I didn't soak. Like, look at that comparison, it's crazy. So usually I take a little squirt bottle and spray my palette a few minutes before I decide to paint. This next tip might seem kind of obvious to some, but it's to always use waterproof liners when watercolor painting. If you like to do line work in your watercolor paintings, then you have to make sure you use a waterproof liner, or else the ink is gonna bleed and completely ruin your painting. Usually the fine liner will say on the side of the barrel if it's waterproof. If not, just look for a fine liner or a brush pen that has India ink in it, because that's 100% waterproof. You can't make a watercolor painting video without talking about watercolor paper. Watercolor paper is the most important part of watercolor painting. Here's the things I look for when buying watercolor paper. I always like to make sure that my watercolor paper is acid-free. I try to buy watercolor paper that's over 130 pounds. I always get cold pressed paper because the texture makes the paint sit more evenly. And lastly, I try to always buy 100% cotton watercolor paper. I'm gonna list a few of my favorite watercolor paper brands on the screen right now. If you guys are curious, you can go check them out. But I'm just going to show you guys the difference between a proper watercolor paper. This is 140 pound watercolor paper that's 100% cotton. I can put so much water on this paper and literally scrub the paper and it does not budge. This paper can really take a beating, as opposed to this paper, which is not made for watercolor paint. As you can see, it starts to pill, and when I try to scrub the paint into the paper, it starts to break. If you have to break the bank for one thing in watercolor painting, I highly suggest you buy some good watercolor paper. One of the most important things to have when watercolor painting is patience. You need to have patience for your layers to dry. If you do not wait for your watercolors to dry, they will bleed into one another and make a giant mess. The great thing about watercolors are that they're transparent and you can layer them. But in order to do so, you must wait until each layer has dried on its own, which can be a little painstaking, but you can also get some amazing effects. My last watercolor tip for you guys is to never use white watercolor paint. I hate white watercolor paint with a passion. Let me tell you guys why. In this example, let's say you're painting two little girls. You want to give them red hair and then you want to lighten the red to make a pink for the skin tone. Now, when you lighten the red with white watercolor paint, it makes the paint cloudy. And it adds a film over all your line art and existing paint, as opposed to just lightening the red with clean water. In watercolor painting, the white of your page is supposed to be the white of the painting. And because watercolors are a transparent medium, by adding more water, more of the white of the page shows through. That's all my watercolor tips and tricks. I hope you guys enjoyed this video and you learned something about watercolor paint. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.